So, how are you feeling after hearing from Dr. Teresa Burke and Kevin Burke? Quite fascinating things, isn't it? I know the atmosphere around here, we've had some people break out in tears, some people being very angry about what they're hearing. I just would like to hear from you. How are you doing? It's a lot to take in. But you know, one thing that we can rest assured in is that God's grace is sufficient for all of us, and that He is a God of love who loves us, and there is hope. There is hope for a better day. So I just encourage you to take this information and just be encouraged about the knowledge you're receiving, and I hope that you're finding, for me, what it did for me was, through all my life experiences, it helped me understand myself.
Right.
Because it's like, how could I have done such a thing? And so, I'm still searching all this out. And so I hope people, that have been affected can say, oh, well, yeah, I was vulnerable. Yeah, I was this. And there's more to come. We've got a whole packed 3 days of figuring all this out.
And I love that you use the word hope, because there's so much to feel right now watching these interviews. Like you said, there's anger, there's sadness, there are so many things. But I love that you said hope, because that is ever present. And as you watch these interviews, you are going to watch a lot of people who have found healing and who have found peace and who have gotten through where you may be today. I know that we have several watching today who are maybe where you were 20 years back in your journey, or at different places. And I hope as you watch these interviews, you're going to feel a lot of things, but don't forget to feel the hope, because you're seeing firsthand that people have found peace and grace.
And grace, yes. I love how you said peace, because what I have found, my four big things is peace with God, peace with yourself, peace with others, and keeping the peace. And that's just not with abortion, is it? It's with, Lexa, you're not perfect. Did you know that?
Oh, I didn't know that.
And Dina, we all have challenges.
Yeah.
My big challenge was abortion, but we all have things, we all have weaknesses, we all have strengths. But peace with God, peace with yourself, peace with others, and keeping the peace. And there were, through my story, there were so many times that I would ask God to forgive me, and then I would take it back. So I just, in my mind, I knew God forgave me because the Bible said He forgives, but I would just kind of take it back. And so it's like, let Him forgive and be okay with that. Give Him that, I ask for your forgiveness, but then don't take it back. Nope, I ask God to forgive me and He forgives me. But it's the heart, and we talk about so much being accepting of yourself. I made a mistake, and there is just so much to learn that tuning into this. But I want to go back. Oh, and you were going to say.
Well, I was going to say, Kaylin, I've learned so much from you. I love what you just shared right now, and you're always saying things that I can apply to my own life. And for this weekend, all of you watching, you're going to have access to that as well, because Kaylin and our team were welcoming questions. And you can ask us on our Facebook page. Our Facebook is Choose Grace International. And if you ask us a question, we'll see who the question's coming from. But we're not going to share where the questions come from. So it will be an anonymous question that you can ask us and we can answer in our live sessions, because I've just learned so much from you, and I'm so excited that all our viewers are now going to have this access to you, that you can send us your questions And Kaylin is so happy to help. So I'm excited that you have that.
Well, it's easier for me to ask questions. It's easier for me to take questions, and I just love to answer them because these are my life experiences. So, and I like to, I like to meet people where they're at.
Right.
And so many times, since this has been so long that I've been talking about it, I sometimes forget, like, right after. And I keep abreast of kind of what's going on. I help with the crisis call line. And, just even this last week, taking a crisis call from a woman that was just distraught, just crying, and, just remembering being right there where they're at. And so many times, and we'll talk about this moral injury piece, is, and they might say, so we're taking our pro-life, pro-choice hats off and just looking at moral injury for what it is. But this particular woman said, when I answered the phone, she was crying. She goes, "I'm pro-choice, but I had an abortion, and I never thought it was going to happen to me, and I'm not feeling so good." And so I take him back, and I was like, "How did you feel about the abortion? Did you feel like it was wrong inside?" And she said, "Well, I believe abortion's good for everybody else, but I never thought it would happen to me." I hear that so many times, and that's how it was for myself. I didn't know really at 17 how I felt about abortion. I felt it was, I used it for birth control. I thought, well, if I ever get pregnant, I'll have an abortion. But so when we say this, we say, on this crisis call, that's moral injury. And there's a difference between objective truth and subjective truth. So objective truth is just truth. And get our truth from the Bible, God's truth. And when after the Enlightenment period, we took that truth out, whatever could be scientifically proved. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes so much sense. And I just think for anyone watching, I love how you said, let's just take off that hat for now, because if you're watching us and one of your hats is that you're pro-choice and you've kind of made that part of your identity, but you're still hurt, it's okay to take care of yourself. And it's okay right now to just kind of take off the hat of policy or, what you think should be available for other people. It's okay to just zone right in on yourself and how do you feel and how are you doing and what do you need. So I love how you're saying take off the hats of these labels that we put on ourselves, and let's just get to where are you right now? Are you okay? Are you needing to process things? Are you hurting? Do you need to feel some of that hope and grace?
Yeah. Very good. So with this call, understanding that objective truth, the subjective truth. So subjective truth is your truth. It's whatever's true for me. And so whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, so that subjective truth allowed her to get that abortion. Just, or subjective truth is, my truth, your truth, but after she had that abortion, that wasn't her truth anymore. So she kind of moved from that subjective truth to the objective. Does that make sense?
It
to
does.
The objective truth. So, it's, and also to circle back, moral injury, you don't have to just have had an abortion to be moral injured. And so it just dawned on me by one of the staff people that are working here is he's very angry about what he's hearing. And so you can be morally injured because when you talk about morally injury, it's a betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority or by oneself in a high-stakes situation. And a legitimate authority is a person that is a holder of responsibility and trust. So these are holders of responsibility and trust that maybe have let us down. And so, I've heard what they call collective moral injury. And a collective moral injury is how society, when they see maybe the abortion procedures, when they see about what abortion is, when they're going to hear some of these stories that we're going to share, especially one coming up with Phil Klein on Sunday, there is going to be some moral injury. And we all will need some moral repair. And we can do that through God.
Yeah.
So yes, and I really do love questions. That's what I love. So
I was just going to add that I think really important is the narratives. As I was watching all of these stories and the experts, I was learning so much on the educational side, but I think I was learning a bit more from people's narratives and people's stories. They were just hearing people's experiences with this and how they've been affected differently. Each person was different. I didn't think anyone had the same experience. And I think that is what really just hit me. It hit home for me because I realized that this can hit people a couple days after their abortion, or I think some people were 30, 40, 50 years later. So yeah, there's definitely more to come.
And I've also heard of, so after an abortion, how we go into denial, and we to silence our conscience, we might do other things like have the career, have everything, and then after the career's over, you're all alone, and you're like my age, and then they can start processing, oh my gosh, what did I do? Because they're now taking the time to think instead of running away.
Right. I think from some of the stories I heard, it's like that empty nest for women, and for men too, but I feel like a lot for women when there's children and teenagers in the household, so much. We were even talking about like traveling for sports, all these busy things that you're doing, managing your household, managing your family, and then sometimes for a lot of the stories I've heard, then once those children are gone, it gets a lot quieter, and there's this time of, here I am with my thoughts. So that's common.
It's common, and a lot of times women have, and we're going to hear stories, some of these interviews, is where they had the abortion and then they were unable to have children. And what happens, the great tragedy with that is, like H. Norman Wright, he talks about grief and loss. He talks about secondary losses that we're not even aware of. And so abortion healing is a process. There was a special woman in my life that I've walked with her, and she shares her testimony, but she's like, I just realized one day I'm not going to be a grandmother. And she's at her age, she sees other moms and other daughters with their children, with their grandmothers, and she said, I'll never have that. So it's just another layer.
Right. Yeah. For me, to put some words behind like the moral injury thing, or a feeling behind it, when it's the collective moral injury, but not something that happened to you personally, to me it a little bit feels like, I can't believe I have to reconcile that this is happening to people in my world, in my community, day to day. Like, I have to figure out how to wrap my head around, now that I've watched these interviews, people are going through this. A lot of people are going through this. And that kind of brings in like the collective moral injury of, we have to figure out what to do next, and how to be, and how to take this information and then move forward with our lives, knowing this depth of pain and this reality for so many people.
And you are going to have a hand in that, because we are going to, our next project is to actually do that. So very exciting. That was a good lead-in. So next up, we have Greg Hassick, and he is a good friend of mine. He wanted to be here so bad, and he was scheduled, but with the new things happening with COVID and health issues, and he was just not able to be here. He is in Florida. I met him several years ago, and he is a trauma specialist, and he works with men and women with abortion. And I think I've already shared, haven't I, about he was the one that introduced me to The Body Keeps the Score. This is a wonderful interview, and I hope you gain a lot of insight. And so, Greg Hassick.
Can I say really quickly?
Yes.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no.
I just want to say so quickly, if you're joining us on social media, the only way for you to see, we're going to show you a whole video right now with Greg, and it's going to show you what you will see if you sign up for the Summit of Grace, because not every video goes out over social media. So this one, you can get an example. This is an example for you. If you want to keep seeing these videos, sign up at Summit of Grace.
Yes, and we also have a workbook.
Yes, we do.
A free workbook that goes along with it, and it's phenomenal. They put that together, and it's wonderful, and it's a free gift from us to you. And so, Greg Hassick, and hope you enjoy it. Hope you stay tuned. Thank you for joining us. And today we have a very special guest, Greg Hassick. And I met Greg several years ago. We've been friends for several years now. We met at a conference. And Greg and I have the same passion, wanting to do someday a retreat center for healing. And initially, Greg, you were wanting to do a retreat center for couples just to help in their pain. Is that right?
Yeah. Originally, we had a vision to take couples out of the counseling office, take them to a place where they could work intensively on their relationship, specifically couples that were going through trauma. I think that's where we kind of started to talk about. We had some similar ideas.
Yes. And so, Greg, tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and what makes you qualified to talk about this subject today.
Okay. Well, we started a Christian nonprofit organization in 2001. It was specifically for helping couples. And then we developed a counseling center after that. So for the last 20 years, I've been in the counseling field, 15 years in Oregon and 5 years in Florida. I got into working with the men in abortion. The area in terms of how abortion impacts men and their kind of moral dilemma they find themselves in as a result of that choice.
Yeah. And you have what is your degree in? Your marriage and family therapist?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed therapist in Florida and Oregon, and I'm a marriage and family therapist.
Okay.
Yeah. So how I got into working with men in abortion originally in the counseling world was my specialization area was in addiction, specifically sex addiction. And what I would do is I would put on my intake form the question if a man had an abortion in his history. And what I found is a lot of my clients that were coming in for specifically, say, sex addiction or other issues, I was finding a large percentage of them had that in their history, but they just never talked about it. So that was my original window into working with men, because men were not coming to the counseling center or to the crisis pregnancy center for help for abortion for a lot of reasons. One being it's culturally kind of not the norm. Men are supposed to be tough and all that. But for a large majority of guys, they don't come to counseling unless they're in a crisis. And that was an opportunity for me when they were in their crisis, like that maybe their marriage was at risk, that I could ask that question. And then eventually I was able to start working with those men regarding abortion. So I had to come to that special opportunity, kind of a backdoor approach. And as a result, was able to do a lot of healing work with those guys.
Okay. So that's how that piqued your interest then on seeing the need. So, so take us back. How do you feel like we got to this place where we're at today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I often talk about that at workshops that I do on abortion throughout the country. And one of the questions I always ask is, how could we as a country get to a place okay? And how could we as individuals get to a place where we would be able to make that choice? And so the first thing that I went to was I wanted to look at basically social psychology looks at why do people do what they do. You remember the old show Candid Camera? Yeah, that was a show that was based on social psychology. It was like people were put into experimental situations, and they were viewed to see what they would do in a certain situation based on conditions. And there were some critical social psychology experiments that were done in the 70s and 60s that really speak to this issue of how did we get to this place where abortion would be okay, even before abortion was legalized in the 70s. The one specific experiment that I'm thinking of was called the Milgram experiment. I don't know if you remember hearing about that. It was Stanley Milgram. And basically, in that experiment, that came as a result of the experimenter, Stanley Milgram, wanted to find out why guards during the Nazi German time would follow the orders of their leaders to kill the Jews. They wanted to find out what would it take for them to go against their moral compass to actually kill people. Took these people into this experiment, and there was volunteers. There were volunteer teachers and students, and the students were to be electrocuted if they didn't answer the questions correctly, but they were really not being electrocuted. They were pretending to be electrocuted. All the way up to the point of almost the highest charge of electricity. And what they found was 65% of those people in the experiment went beyond their moral code to the point of almost killing these people in terms of electrically shocking them if they answered the question wrong. What came out of this experiment was, why would people violate their ethical and moral code to hurt people or actually to the extent of killing people? And what they found from that experiment was that if an authority figure tells them to do something and that it's okay, they were willingly able to then moral code. And the second thing they found is if the authority figure took responsibility for the person if they died. So as we look at that experiment, we go, okay, how did we get to a place in our country where abortion would be legal in terms of trusting our authorities, and what our authorities are telling is okay? And what we found is people will violate their moral code if they believe authorities are doing what's best for them. And again, we saw this going all the way back to Nazi Germany. And there was one more experiment that was famous. It was called the Stanford Prison Experiment, and that was done in the 70s. And this was an experiment where they brought two groups of volunteers in to a mock prison experiment. One group of volunteers were prison guards. The other group of volunteers were prisoners. And they had to play out certain roles. And they wanted to see what would happen once these people played out those roles. And they had to stop the experiment within the first week because the guards were actually becoming more dangerous and violent toward the prisoners, and the prisoners were actually playing out their roles as prisoners, even though they were just volunteers. And what came out of that experiment was that the idea that people will play out a role, even if it goes against their ethical and moral beliefs, especially in a group, they will follow. And taking those two social science experiments, we can look at then how did we get to a place where we, through our authorities and through following what we are being told is a role that we're supposed to play, when does that then bypass our moral code? And does that make sense?
It does, because how I've said, like with the moral injury piece, how I'm seeing the parallel with abortion is when we're taught in our schools in public education about abortion. Because that was always a question in my mind when I was like, because as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I'm like, how was I so bent, got to get an abortion? And, going back, they were authority figures. They were seen, it was pedagogy learning, when you're elementary school and you're taking in what these legitimate authorities are telling you and introducing you to. So part of when I was thinking, I felt that it was wrong, and I felt like there was, whether I wanted to call it a baby or whatever, I knew life was growing inside of me that would become a baby or, was a baby. Yeah. And then having it legal, I just thought, well, maybe it's just my parents that, maybe it's just them that are like, thinking that abortion is wrong. So I went ahead and did it. So, yeah, I totally get that with the authority figure.
Yeah, you start to question your own morality when people are telling you that it's okay, especially
right.
Your authorities or the U.S. government. And again, that collective group mentality, it's hard to come against a group that's saying it's okay.
And so, it's good, and it's, it's just a bump of tissue, that go home and never have to think about it again. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, good thought.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is there was a term called classical conditioning. This was years ago studied in like what they call behaviorism in psychology. And what they found is that people can be conditioned to kill. And one of the things that I said in some of my workshops that I'll ask them the question, do you think you can be conditioned to kill somebody? And people are pretty shocked by that question. And I have them think about that. And I say, okay, if I could prove to you that we can condition our soldiers to kill people in battle through a video game or a simulator and be desensitized to the point once they get over onto the battlefield, they don't feel the effects anymore, then I think we can condition our culture and us as individuals to be desensitized to the actual life. And I think that's another part of, when we look at how did we get here, we've been desensitized to killing. We've been desensitized to, and we know that's what happens to soldiers when they come back from war. This moral injury that they have is, whoa, how did I get to the place where I could do this? In those two experiments, one, desensitization and we use of video games and things like that, listening to authority, going back to the experiment I mentioned earlier, and then the group mentality. All the soldiers in war go through those three conditions in order for them to violate their moral code. They're conditioned, they have authority telling them what to do, and they have a group mentality that's encouraging them to violate their moral code. And so I think we can take those things and go, okay, let's apply that to how we got to a place individually and as a culture of how we could choose abortion and violate our own moral code.
Well, in combat veterans, they would how they were, as I understand it, being desensitized is by name calling, like you didn't call. I mean, I can't remember what they called, but they were desensitizing. Like if whoever they were going to go to war with, they would call them by a name. And
Yeah.
so,
Well, even the debate about video games with children, you know, can you desensitize the debate about video games with children? Can you desensitize a child to kill through a video game? Well, you can a soldier,
yes,
you know. So I think we can desensitize ourselves to a lot of things, and we don't realize it's wearing away at the fabric of who we were, who we are. And all of a sudden we look back years later and we don't realize how we got here.
yes. And see, for me, it was, and we heard so many stories where they say it's a product of conception. So, you know, you don't say baby, you know, it's a product of conception. And, you know, the same, you know, it's a blob or it's a clump. So that's the desensitizing terminology. But, you know, like I interviewed Dr. Donna Harrison just yesterday, and she was talking about how the RU-486, you know, when they pass, they see that it's a fully formed baby, and that's where some of the trauma happens and occurs. So anything else to add on that?
Yeah. I just want to say, how do men get to a place? And when I said, how do we as a country, how do we as individuals, how do men specifically get to a place where they violate or they go against their moral code of protecting and providing for their spouse or their partner and their children? How does a man get beyond that? And I think we saw some of the conditioning happening starting in the 70s with the women's rights movement, starting with men losing their legal right to whether an abortion can be performed or not, and continuing on as they tended to now be viewed more as perpetrators of trauma versus victims of trauma. And so men got conditioned themselves to give up that natural role because they didn't feel like they had the right for that role anymore. And so now we've got a conditioning of the very fabric of a man that's violating his own moral code and his innate need to provide and protect. And I think there's really serious damage done at that deep level of a man when how he's created to be somehow has been taken away from him through that conditioning process since really the 70s.
That's really interesting. And I would imagine, you know, with some of the men I've interviewed, you know, there is a helplessness, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, that men don't have a voice in that. They're told that, you know, it's a woman's choice. And so what does that do to the core of a man? Once they start believing that for the last 20, 30, 40 years, it's a woman's choice, they begin to believe it's a woman's choice. And so, but at deep down inside, they know that's not right, but they don't know what to do with that, right? They want to stand up and protect their child, but they can't. And so, yeah, it goes against all how they were created to be. It's like someone telling you can't protect your child. What damage does that do? You know, and so, yeah, I think there's a lot of different levels of how men specifically have been affected in terms of how they get to the point of violating their own moral and ethical code and the injury that's caused to them as a man. That's even different than the injury that a woman goes through.
Well, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about how it impacts a man traumatically. And me and you talked a little bit about this earlier. in terms of how men are different than women in terms of how abortion affects a man. So, you know, men feel omnipotent responsible when the decision is made for an abortion. Even if it was the woman's decision, men still feel omnipotent and responsible for that abortion.
And what do you mean by omnipotent?
They feel because they're a man, they were part of the conception process. They didn't have to do that. Even if the woman at that point says, I want an abortion, and the man says, I don't want an abortion, they still feel responsible because that was their God-given, you know, a role of procreating, right? And they knew that they failed at leading that woman in the way that they need to lead. You know, whether it was maybe not getting her pregnant, you know. I think the other thing that happens is after a man finds out that their spouse or their partner is pregnant, if they have any kind of previous trauma, okay?
Sorry, my microphone's going out.
Yeah, that previous trauma that male has is going to impact that current trauma of making the decision of whether to abort that child because of how the brain is affected by previous trauma. In other words, if that man finds out that his partner's pregnant and it catches him off guard, and that man has childhood trauma, the brain is already preconditioned to go into a PTSD mode, kind of like a fight or flight mode, when that partner comes to him and says, I'm pregnant. So if a man has previous trauma, it's going to impact his ability at that moment of what to do about that pregnancy. And that understanding of that man's previous trauma helps in the forgiveness process of when that woman later looks at that man and says, why did you abandon me? Or why didn't you support me in the decision? When they finally understand that man's brain, if he had previous trauma, was actually wired to kind of go into a traumatic place where he was now no longer rational in his thinking to make that decision. Once that decision is made, there's regret and remorse, but that's because the right brain of that traumatized man is no longer in that heightened state. And now he feels guilt and remorse and he's rational.
Now, Greg, I'm going to stop just for a second about men. So, you know, so many times women say, why didn't I learn my lesson the first time? And they have multiple abortions. Would it be safe to say that if they were traumatized by that first abortion, that they follow in the same line as what you've just been talking about?
Exactly. Yeah. If a woman's had an abortion already, it was obviously traumatic, most likely for them. The impact of that, even if they say, I'll never have an abortion again, when they're in that situation, their right brain, because of PTSD symptoms, goes into a mode of wanting to either fight or flight or solve that problem so they're not in a state of angst. So their actual left brain goes offline and they're acting out of that angst and that previous trauma. And so again, what happens is once they make that second abortion decision and their traumatized right brain starts to calm down and then their left brain starts to come back online, that's where the regret and the remorse comes in. Now, if you think about what I was talking about earlier with soldiers in war, when a soldier's in a battle and his PTSD brain kicks on and says, I need to shoot somebody, it's the same kind of thing that happens to a woman's brain when I'm pregnant again. It's the fear, the trauma makes that person make a decision so quickly that they're not able to be rational until it's over, until the soldier comes back from battle, until the woman comes back from the abortion clinic, and then the rational brain kicks on and goes, what did I do? What did I do? And
You introduced me a few years ago to this book, The Body Keeps the Score, and it's brain, mind, and body and the healing of trauma. And what we're talking about, I'd just like to read just a piece to the viewers about, what we're talking about here. And it's by Bessel van der Kolk, and he writes, while we all want to move beyond trauma, the part of our brain that is devoted to ensuring our survival, deep below our rational brain, is not very good at denial. Long after traumatic experience is over, it may be reactivated at the slightest hint of danger and mobilize disturbed brain circuits and secrete massive amounts of stress hormones. This precipitates unpleasant emotions, intense physical sensations, and impulsive and aggressive actions. These post-traumatic reactions feel incomprehensible and overwhelming. Feeling out of control, survivors of trauma often begin to fear that they are damaged to the core and beyond redemption. And we see this so many times and hear this so many times in women and men that cannot move past their abortion.
no, that speaks to it perfectly and how that was written. And, when we talk about looking at ways of forgiving oneself after the choice, after you violated your own moral beliefs, you have to look at the brain and your previous trauma and what I talked about earlier, the conditioning, the social science experiments, all these things together and say, I can forgive myself knowing my brain was a part of it, my previous trauma was a part of it in terms of my decision, my conditioning from culture, my obeying authority. You look at all these things and you go, okay, I can forgive myself knowing that if I had a different opportunity in a different circumstance, I wouldn't have made this choice. But there were so many things leading up to it. And I think that's huge in terms of forgiveness.
And I do too. And there's something else that I want to talk to about this. And, it's come to light that, abortion facilities, it is a business. And it's a money-making business. And they market in such a way. And so I think for couples, especially for women, I guess I can't say especially for women, I can't speak for men, but, we're in a very vulnerable place. We're pregnant. We're very vulnerable and scared. I mean, it's a crisis. And one of the things, Greg, that you pointed out is what happens with men, they do not get the rights, or they feel like they have to take a step back. Well, what's happened then is women have to take a step forward and saying, if I have this baby, I've got to care for it, I've got to provide for it, I'm going to have to work, a double shift, I, because there's no man. So what we've done is, what was originally designed as together, male and female, to share in the responsibilities, now women look at it as, I've got to do all of it. And so that's the outcome that's happened when men have had to take a step back, women have had to take a step forward. And the marketing. So when I was at 17 and I was scared and vulnerable and thinking that was an authority figure, I was naive thinking that, they had my best interest. And, some of them, I can't say that they didn't. I mean, they were, they felt like they were really helping people. But it didn't help me because of my moral code. And just like what we were talking about, I felt like my crisis pregnancy was traumatic, and I needed to survive. My brain was going into survival mode. So I think those are two key pieces I know that helped me to forgive myself, but then also to accept myself. Young Kaylin was very vulnerable and scared and just trying to make a decision based on the facts that she had and where she was at. And, so go ahead.
I like that, Kaylin, because thinking about young Kaylin, and a lot of times I do that with my clients and have them picture, even if they have a picture, and go back and say, okay, seeing that person through a different lens at that young age and what they were having to go through and the decisions that they were having to make by themselves, it does really help with forgiveness. But the other thing I'll say is, like say Planned Parenthood or a abortion clinic, when a person is in a state of crisis, when they are in a state of trauma, that part of the brain is also related to the part of the brain that's connected to attachment. So the first couple of years of a child's life. So when you're in a PTSD moment or a crisis moment and you're in a fight or flight mode, the attachment system within your brain is also it's connected at the same time. So that means if you walk into a Planned Parenthood and they offer some kind of comfort and support, that is what soothes that attachment. Like, we're here for you, we understand. It's almost like a parent soothing a child in a time of crisis.
Oh, I know for me it was. They were so nice and so helpful and so loving. I remember being on that abortion table and just crying and shaking. And, I asked how much longer. And the woman at the bedside, she was just petting my hand and saying, it's okay. Everything's going to be okay. And I said, how much longer? And she said, don't worry, my dear. In 20 seconds, when the vacuum noise comes on, then only be 20 seconds longer and you can go home and, you can never have to think about it again. You're not going to be pregnant. Your parents will never have to know. And, you can live your life and have a future. And I'm like, yeah. And then the 20 seconds came and it was over. And I did have relief, but I also had a lot of other emotions that dwelled inside of me.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. When you're offered comfort and you're in that crisis, you will most likely make that decision because you feel cared for. And that's why when I've talked to like sidewalk counselors that are talking to people that are walking up to an abortion clinic, and I tell them, listen, if that abortion clinic inside offers more comfort and care than you outside with a sign, what do you think they're going to do? They're
scared. Yeah, they're scared.
As a counselor that's trying to reach these people that are going into these clinics, or a sidewalk counselor, how to approach them in a way that is validating their feelings and caring and comfort, versus these signs with babies or whatever that's creating more trauma. And then basically they're walking right past them into the abortion clinic where they feel more care. And that ends up being, part of the reason why they choose sometimes.
Cared and more understood, I would say.
Right. Yeah. Can I talk briefly about the abortion clinic experience for the man's perspective?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, please.
So Arthur Shostak, back, I think it was in the 80s, he did a research study on thousands of men in the abortion clinic rooms across the country.
And how many? Sorry?
It was over 1,000.
Okay.
He interviewed men that would be sitting in the abortion clinic waiting for their partner to come out. And he asked them several questions. And what he found was 90-something% of them said that they regret and they don't ever want to be in that place again with their spouse or their girlfriend, you know. And so it was this kind of this idea that, you know, this stereotypical view that men don't care, men don't go to abortion clinics with their spouses or their partners, they're insensitive, and this research was out to prove that was not the case. In fact, a lot of men do go to the clinics, a lot of men do suffer, and a lot of men just don't show their feelings. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fight or flight experience. So we were talking about that book, The Body Keeps the Score. And what Bessel van der Kolk found in his research on 9/11 and Katrina was very interesting. He found that the PTSD rates in Katrina were actually higher than 9/11. And the reason I point this out is through all the trauma research, what they found is if you inhibit the flight mechanism while you're going through a trauma, the PTSD rates go up. So if you inhibit the flight mechanism, and that means someone that's being raped can't run from their rapist, going through an abortion, you can't get off the table, you know. So in 9/11, what they found is the PTSD rates were lower because the people could run, and they were running from New York City, and they were going home, and the people in Katrina were trapped, and they were stuck in their buildings, and they were airlifted in stretchers, and they couldn't go to their families for comfort. And so taking that research and looking at the abortion clinic experience on a body level, what's happening for the man and the woman in that abortion clinic is the woman is trapped in her flight. She can't get up off that table and run. Now that does damage, okay? That does damage because when the body doesn't do what it's supposed to do, there's consequences. And then what happens to that male at that point when he's waiting in the waiting room is he can't act on his fight to protect her, to provide for her and the child and her safety. So two things happen traumatically in that one moment is the woman walks out of the abortion clinic, did not act on her flight, and the man walks out of the abortion clinic and did not act on his fight. So you have two people traumatized walking out that door, and at their very core of what they should have done to prevent the trauma, they couldn't do. And that, you know, on a body level, that does damage. And there's a whole psychological theory around what's called somatic experiencing, and some of it came out of the Bessel van der Kolk work, but it talks about how to release the body from the trauma it still stores. And that's part of it. So I wanted to share a little bit of my personal experience, if that's okay. So back in the 80s, I found myself in a place where my girlfriend was pregnant. And she came to me, and of course, like a lot of guys, it was very shocking. And I didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do. We thought about all the options. You know, we thought about, did we have the money? Could you know, was our relationship in a place that it would support a child? What about our parents? And we went through all the things that most people go through.
And how old were you?
See, I was around 23.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, so during that time, it was a tough time to try to make the right decision. And we ended up being influenced by what I talked about earlier, but being influenced by the normalization of what's happening in our culture and the stresses and the acting on our fight or flight and all those things. And so we ended up, it was a mutual decision. It was not something that she made by herself or that I made by myself or coerced her. It was a mutual decision. But I went with her to the abortion clinic, and I sat in that waiting room. And like I was saying earlier, I was not able to act on my fight. And everything in me, I wanted to get up off my chair, go into the door where she was in there, open the door and say, stop. You're not going to do that to her, and you're not going to do that to my child. Everything in me, and I know that is the story of every man that sits there, because that's our nature. That's our nature, right? To protect the person we're with and the child. But we knew we couldn't do that. We knew because they wouldn't let us, right? I mean, and we're in that dilemma, are we doing the right thing? And I remember sitting in there, and the doctor came out afterwards to talk to me. And he gave me one brief moment, and he says, she's okay. That's all he said. She's okay. She'll be out in a little while. And I thought to myself, in that very moment, that's all the doctor said was she's okay. And I remember her face when she walked out was very different. Like something had like something had affected her soul. And to that day, you know, we would never be the same. And we walked out of that abortion clinic in that trauma bubble together. She couldn't act on her fight, I couldn't act on my fight, and we ended up breaking up later, and which a lot of couples do after abortion, as we know. So I have personal experience with some of those elements that I'm talking about. And my healing journey has been impacted by the very things that I talked about today, which is, how did I get to the place? How did we get to the place? And I have to have that understanding in order for me to have grace on myself. And I look through that lens of everything that I said earlier, and I say, okay, I do know, I understand how I got there. And that brings a lot of forgiveness that way.
And I think at that point, for me, when I got to that point, is I could accept the pain. So many times, you know, it's like, we're separate from it. We don't want to, that abortion is not me. I want to forget it. But then once you embrace the pain and you embrace what happened and you embrace, you know, all the circumstances, it's easy to have more self-forgiveness and self-acceptance. And then look at the meaning, look at what lessons were learned from that so that you could carry on. And for me, that's how that's just how I feel like I've learned the lessons in my life about, you know, my past, and that it doesn't have to define who I am, but I can understand it and move forward now.
Yes, exactly. And I think that is part of learning to love yourself, you know, for what you've been through, and because you love yourself through understanding and empathy, and, you know,
and have grace for yourself. You know, that's why the ministry is choose grace. You know, choose grace for yourself and choose to accept God's grace and forgiveness.
One other thing I'll say about men, back in the 80s, there was no programs for men that had gone through an abortion. There was no counseling. There was no places at crisis pregnancy centers. It took me 5 years to find a place that was a crisis pregnancy center in Greensboro, North Carolina, that invited me into one of their women's groups. I was the only man after 5 years of looking, and I did a lot of drinking during that time. And but I finally found a place where this group of women took me in, and that began my journey for having a heart for men that don't have a place to go. They don't have a voice, and the pain of abortion on men is so invalidated in our culture, we don't have many places to go to get help, right? And even to this day, all these years later, that was part of what I felt like my call on my life was, is to help these guys find a voice. But even to this day, there's just not many programs.
So I know of some, but where would you suggest men go? I know we have like Warren Williams that's speaking and he's got curriculum, but do you have places where men could go that you would suggest to get more information?
Yeah, like in 2005, we started the Men Abortion Network, which was a group of people that had interest in two things. One is creating awareness of how abortion affects men, and then providing resources for men that have been affected by abortion. So they can go to Men in Abortion website. They can find out some resources and information, and oftentimes we can lead them in a direction of finding a counselor or maybe a support group or something. There are a few, groups around, crisis pregnancy centers around the country, but there's also some more and more counselors are starting to kind of come out there and address the issue.
So is that meninabortion.net.com? What is that website?
I think it's meninabortionnetwork.org.
meninabortionnetwork.org. Okay.
So again, but that's, on our basis issue, most men are not going to seek help because they are conditioned to believe they shouldn't hurt from it. So why would I get help for it? It's
Go ahead.
They don't have permission, right?
Well, it makes it more of a complicated grief, just, like women do. But Greg, I remember you sharing with me once, that men and women, and we're about out of time, but men and women grieve differently. Us in a few minutes, like how men grieve.
Yeah. I always said that men grieve by doing versus being. And so a lot of support groups for women are centered around being in a circle and talking about feelings and processing and all that. But the typical male doesn't process their grief the same way. They don't like to sit and look at other men in a circle. They don't like to talk about their feelings with other guys. That's why the attempts at starting support groups for men have not been very well lasting because of that. And this is true in church ministry too. But men grieve by thinking more. They think more than feel. They like to do things, so they're active, like going out and playing a golf game with a friend. These are the things that they do. They process by doing. And there was an interesting study that was done years ago after the tsunami in Asia. They found, the psychologists went over there and they looked at men and women, and they found groups of women, support groups on the beaches, crying and supporting each other because they had lost their children to the tsunami. And the psychologists went to look for the men, and they found that the men were walking around the countryside and doing all kinds of other things. And they asked the men, why aren't you down there on the beach with your wives grieving the loss of your children? And they said, we don't have time to grieve the loss of our children. We got to rebuild our homes. We got to go help each other find things and financially support. And so this is how guys do their grieving. They tend to be more active. And so we can't put men into a box and say, well, they're from abortion because we don't see them. Well, they are grieving from abortion. It's just you don't see them in the right ways. And oftentimes because we do not have the cultural acceptance for men to grieve from abortion, they grieve through their addictions.
Oh.
Because that's how they internalize their pain
you know, good ways and not so good ways to relieve your pain. You know, those are the negative ways to relieve your pain. And so the positive ways to relieve your pain and grief would be doing something active for men, having more activity. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, like when you're thinking about creating programs for post-abortion men and women, to kind of create them in terms of how men and women are different and be creative. And yeah, if the program is more active, more one-on-one for men than in a group, men tend to do better walking one-on-one down a golf course. Like I said, I remember a client of mine, father died, and he's very close to his father, and you know, there was no way I was going to get him to sit in my room and talk about his dad. But he went to the golf course where him and his dad would golf, and every tee he would stop, he would cry a little bit. Feel. If you don't feel, and you have